Hello again. For this video, I just wanted to say a couple of things about this literary analysis essay and just give some advice about how to approach it. Obviously, you'll submit rough drafts, and I'll give you my specific comments on what you've done so far. But I just wanted to say a few things, before we get to that point. One difficulty, I think, with this kind of essay, where again, what we're doing is making an argument. It's still an argument essay in a way, right? We have something we're trying to convince the audience of, something we're trying to prove. But the thing here is that the evidence for what we're trying to say is going to be what comes from the story, the quotes from the story, the things that happen in the story. So if we're trying to say that, a story like the story of an hour or a pair of silk stockings, if we're trying to say that those stories criticize the way women were treated at the time, or specifically, which again, we want to be as specific as we can. So if we say that they specifically criticize the idea that women should sacrifice themselves for the family in a way that men are not expected to, if the story's trying to say, well, that's bad, that's not how it should be. If we were going to prove that, I guess I would ask, like, well, how do you know that's what the story's saying? How do we know that the story's trying to tell us that the idea that women should be the only ones to sacrifice? How do we know that the story's telling us that that's bad? And like, I don't know, some stories could be saying that that's good. I could imagine a story being like that. How do we know that these stories are specifically trying to show us that that idea is bad? And that's going to come from quotes from the story, things that happen in the story. One thing I want to say here, one difficulty is like how much summary do we give from the story? Um, and I would say I would caution you against trying to just like summarize the entire story in one paragraph. These are pretty short stories, so maybe it wouldn't be that much of an issue. But like something I've seen when I do this essay with other stories with students is they want to have a paragraph at the beginning where they just like summarize the entire thing, and you don't have to do that. This isn't like a book report. The goal of what you're doing is not to just tell me every single thing that happened in the story. You don't have to do that. You can assume that your reader has read the story that you're writing about. Maybe you don't want to assume that they read it like 5 minutes ago or that they just finished reading it, but you can assume that they've read it before. And ultimately, the summary of the story, the things that happen in the story, are only relevant to your essay if they back up your argument. Your argument is your thesis. The message the story is sending, that's your thesis for this essay. The stuff that happens in the story, that's the evidence. That's the support for your thesis. So if we're looking at it that way, we have to make sure the argument comes first and that what we're trying to do is prove that argument. We're using the things that happen in the story to prove that argument. So if we look at it that way, there could be things that happen in the story. And again, these are short stories, so maybe it wouldn't happen so much, but there could be things that happen in the story, maybe even things that are important to the story itself that don't really get mentioned in your essay if it doesn't fit into your argument, you know? So you want to be making the argument and using the stuff that happens in the story to prove your argument about the story, right? Um, Another thing you want to avoid is like the point of this essay is not for you to give your opinion on like gender issues or the treatment of women. Your opinion on that, you can have whatever opinion you want on that, but that's just not what this essay is about. It's your opinion about what the story is saying about these topics, right? So that's always something that's hard to balance is like how much to summarize the story and how to make sure that, like, and then how much of your argument to have. And I would say that you really want the argument to be the bigger part of it. You want the thesis to be the main thing, and then only use the summary to back up that thesis. It's not a book report. You don't have to tell me everything that happens in the story. So once we're thinking about it that way, when you do use quotes from the story, and I do expect you to use quotes from the stories in your analysis because that is going to be your biggest piece of evidence. When you use quotes from the story, I would always make sure to explain the quote. Obviously, we've talked before about introducing quotes and explaining quotes. But you want to make sure that by explaining the quote, you give us the thing that it says in the story, and then you explain to us how that backs up your thesis. You explain to us why that is, in fact, a piece of evidence for the argument that you're trying to make to us. So this is something that's tough, and I'll try to provide guidance on this with the rough drafts, but you've got to make sure that the only reason you should be quoting the story or summarizing things that happen in the story is to back up your argument about the message the story's saying, about what the story's trying to say about gender and the position of women and everything. Um, and again, I would try to come up with a thesis that is more like says that the story is trying to criticize the idea that women should sacrifice themselves in a way that men don't have to, or you could look at the other way and say the story is trying to argue for women like focusing on their own happiness as well. It's not that like the women in these stories. It's not like they're never. Well, I mean, Mrs. Mallard, I guess, dies at the end of Story of an Hour, but the woman, Mrs. Summers, in A Pair of Silk Stockings, once she goes home, like I think she is gonna take care. It's not like she's abandoning her kids or something. It's not like she's being so selfish that the kids are like gonna be screwed now. And the things that she was gonna buy for her kids, clothes and stuff, like that's important. But it's not like her choice was like, oh, do I buy food for the kids, or do I go to a play by myself? And then she chose that. Like, if her kids were now gonna die of starvation or something, I think that would be a little bit different. But it's more, I think the story is trying to show that there should at least be some space for women to kind of pursue their own happiness and desires and stuff. Again, in a time period where that doesn't really seem to have existed very much. So you just want to make sure that your argument, your thesis is not like, oh, well, this is what it was like back then, but that it's like the story is trying to criticize the idea that women should have to sacrifice themselves, or similarly, that like the story is trying to like endorse the idea that their own happiness should be considered in the stuff that they're doing. Okay, so I think that's what I wanted to say there. Just trying to get that balance between how much summary we have and the quotes that we have, and making sure that the argument, the thesis, is still the central thing of this essay. All right, more stuff coming soon. See you later.